So the basic thesis is that energy planning as a topic really is in crisis today. So traditional approaches to energy planning, primarily in developing countries, are beginning to fail. And the problems we're beginning to see today are only going to get much worse in the future. But that's not an excuse for not doing planning. Planning, I mean, I live in the US where planning is, almost one of the dirtiest words you can say. But I'm not saying that we should throw it away. Markets alone cannot be relied upon to solve the challenges ahead, especially the climate and pollution challenges. So we do need planning, but it has to be something different from before. So I'm going to give you some thoughts on what needs to be different, and also just say a few words about some of the things that SEI is doing to address the challenge. So what can we say about traditional planning? Well, some of what I'll say applies mainly to planning of electricity, but I think it applies to energy and climate planning more generally as well. So traditionally, energy planning has been a very relatively simple top-down process, something that coupled very simple forecasts of what the demands for energy would be in the future, with most of the focus being on supply planning. So we would have very sort of top-down forecasts of how the demand for electricity and energy would increase over the coming years. And basically the question was, how many power plants are we going to build in the future? That was essentially the process that governments would go through, and as markets have liberalized over the last 20 years, a lot of that activity has moved down to the utility scale. So these approaches worked reasonably well. They never worked all that well, and in fact, going back to the 1970s, these kind of top-down approaches were seen to be vastly overestimating the growth in energy. In the US, famously, the utilities always forecast much more growth than really happens. But they worked reasonably well in certain situations. So they worked well when prices were stable and the supply of energy was fairly reliable. You were able to get away with these simple approaches when your energy system was relatively simple. You had large, centralized, monopolistic utilities, and there was a kind of a one-to-many relationship between the utilities and the energy system and sort of millions of customers out there. They also worked well when the supply was dominated by a few relatively large power plants, and you could dispatch those power plants in a fairly predictable way. So when the system was dominated by fossil plants and hydro plants, things weren't so complicated. Also, you could do this planning in a context knowing that you had many years ahead to get things right or wrong. So the plants took a long time to build, they had very long lifetimes, and the demand was growing gradually and predictably, so things were relatively easy. And also, we didn't have to worry about externalities in the past. We didn't realize that the climate problem was emerging. It was as bad as we know it is today, and air pollution was really just an emerging problem. So we could largely ignore that problem. So when you had a simple system like this in developing countries, you had a large monopolistic system, this is actually a very good vehicle for pursuing some of your social policy. So in many countries over the last 20 years and still today, energy systems are used to pursue your social policy. So they're used to try and give cheaper power to poorer customers, particularly in countries like India and China. That's been a way of helping your development issues by cross-subsidizing your poorer consumers and asking your industries and your commercial consumers to pay more. And also because of this large system, typically you'd have parastatal utilities, so large government-owned utilities, and they would be a vehicle for government to pursue its social objectives. And this was usually done by just directing the utilities and telling them what to do. And the upshot of that is usually the utilities had to do it regardless of whether they could afford it or not. So you end up with these utilities that tend to be underfinanced, undercapitalized, and not very profitable. In fact, many of them make losses. But emerging trends are threatening this model. So we've been able to get away with that model for the last 30 years, but things are really beginning to change fast now. There's been unprecedented growth in renewable energy technologies. There's been large improvements in energy efficiency technologies. So all of those things go to make the whole system much more complicated and hard to predict. large utilities are increasingly facing competition from private power producers. Partly that's as a result of government policies to open up the electric market, but it's also because we have this sort of behind-the-meter energy production going on now. So we have the emergence of solar power as a very important factor. People are referring to people producing power at home as prosumers, so they're producers and consumers. And there's been growing volatility in fuel prices, partly because trade has increased in the energy sector, so the fuels needed to go into power plants are a much more global commodity now. So if there's demand or supply shocks, those tend to reverberate around the world, and things are getting much more volatile. There's also emerging technologies for better managing loads, so demand-side management, energy efficiency, smart grids, those kinds of things. And the technology for energy storage is also getting much, much better. So all of those things are making the whole system much more complicated. There's also important emerging new markets for electricity. So it's not just that electricity demand is staying constant. There's a likelihood of really big new markets emerging. So key areas like transportation, electric vehicles are going to be very important over the next 20, 30 years. And also in areas like heating and cooling of buildings. So we have the emergence of sort of heat pumps as a very, possibly very important way of heating and cooling buildings in the future. So the upshot of this is that traditional ways of doing planning just aren't going to work anymore. Utilities are at risk of losing their highest paying customers. So, government, on a sort of wider scale, governments are probably going to lose the ability to use energy systems to cross-subsidize one group of customers with another. You just can't keep asking the higher-paying customers to keep paying more because they're going to go off and make their own energy using solar power or whatever. And then we've got this sort of broader trend, which I'm sure most people in this room are fairly familiar with, I know my colleagues are, of, we've really got a much better understanding now of the importance of air pollution and climate change. So there really is a need now for governments to step in and manage this process. And I'm just going to go into a few of those things in a little bit more detail. Okay, so let's just unpack a couple of those things. So the first one is the emergence of renewable energy technologies, and those really are changing the game in a very dramatic way. Non-hydro renewable energy is increased by a factor of 7, capacity for non-hydro renewable energy over the last 10 or so years, so enormous increases. And we're only just beginning to see that trend happening now. So, if you think it's been an important trend so far, you ain't seen nothing yet, right? Because as prices come down, renewable energy is going to be extremely competitive with fossil-based energy in the coming 10, 20 years. Costs from solar modules fell 75%. I won't repeat all the statistics there. Similar, not quite as dramatic improvements in wind prices. And those are forecast to continue reducing in the future, partly as the technology gets better, as the wind turbines get larger and the capacity factors go up. That's all going to help drive down the price of wind power, and it's going to be very competitive. It already is very competitive in many situations, and that's just going to keep on coming. At the same time, the technologies that you need to complement your variable renewable energy, those are beginning to improve as well. So the prices for large-scale, utility-scale battery storage are coming down. They fell by 20% in 2014, and apparently fell by another 15% in 2015. So there's a really big improvement going on there. At the same time, we've seen this trend of increased volatility in fuel prices. So that's very important, especially for oil importing or energy importing developing countries. But it's also important in even in countries that have large domestic resources. So we've seen countries like India, which are very dependent on coal. They've really suffered from the increased volatility in the price of the fuel. They've had to import much more of their coal recently. And bear in mind that this is an important issue because renewable energy technologies are really immune from this issue. And then there's the environmental imperative for change. So maybe I won't go deeply into this, but just to say, we can talk about having climate change targets and low carbon futures, but let's not kid ourselves. The world is not reducing carbon emissions at the moment. Carbon emissions are growing by a couple of % per year. The chart down at the bottom here shows you what we need to do. So this was done a while ago. So what we really need to be doing for some hope of keeping warming down to 2 degrees is to be on that red line there. So we need to be, according to the best science, eliminating carbon emissions by 2040. And there's no way we're on a path to do that. At the same time, the issue of air pollution, we're beginning to understand that much more fully now. This chart at the top is from the Global Burden of Disease, and you can see that health issues related to air pollution are actually the 4th and 7th most important global issues in terms of global burden of disease. So air pollution from fossil fuels, which is a key part of that, is really vitally important. So those all tell us why we have to make dramatic changes to the system. It's not enough to just tinker around the edges. Okay, and developing countries are really not in a good position to deal with these challenges. So, we have to address some fairly major challenges here, and we're not really ready to do that. So the kind of planning processes that are going on at the moment in the developing world really are not suitable for addressing the kind of detailed planning that needs to go on to take on these challenges. The data available in most countries is in very poor condition. We haven't been collecting data on technologies and energy services. Some of my colleagues here know what I'm talking about because they've just been trying to do that. And more broadly than that, we have very limited capacity in government agencies. So we don't really have the people we need to take on the challenge analytically. And the result of that is that most developing countries are highly reliant on foreign consultants to tell them what their energy policy should be. So we're not really in a position where developing countries can sort of set their own agendas for energy planning. The modeling tools available tend to be too expensive, too complex, and too data intensive. So we're really in quite a bad situation. So what can be done about this? Well, we require new approaches for integrated energy planning. We need approaches that are much more holistic, much more bottom-up and service-based. We need to take a scenario approach. So rather than trying to sort of do a single set of forecasts and do least cost planning, we need to take more of a scenario-based approach where we can identify robust solutions. We need to properly account for the impacts of efficiency, for the growth of renewable energy and storage. We need to fully consider environmental dimensions, so not just thinking about greenhouse gas emissions, but also thinking about the impacts of air pollution on human health, agriculture, and ecosystems. And we need to move away from this sort of technocratic approach where we trust our energy future to a sort of single planner to get it right. We need to have more people involved, because really the issue is about sort of what future do we want? What do we want our energy systems to look like? So we have to have broader conversations about these trends. So this is a huge challenge. To do this is really expecting us to do something that's much more complex than the traditional planning, and even that's something that's a challenge in most developing countries. So really there's a long-range agenda here. We need to build the capacity in agencies and governments and elsewhere to be able to do this kind of activity. Just a couple more slides. So what is SEI doing about this? Well, we're trying to make a small contribution on some of these issues. One of the things we've been doing is developing various modeling tools that are really based around this idea of doing sort of holistic, integrated energy planning. In particular, there's a tool we've been developing for the last 25 or so years called LEAP, which is very much targeted at the needs of developing country planners. It's now being used in 190 countries, and we have thousands of users all over the world. We've been disseminating that tool for free to developing country organizations for more than 20 years. We also do a lot of work teaching the basic skills that are needed to do this kind of analysis. And then we've been fostering communities of practice to build planning capacity. We've also been working to advance the science on these issues. So a couple of things I'll mention that we've been doing recently, but just a couple I mentioned. One is we've been developing new tools to assess the human health and ecosystem impacts of energy scenarios. And we're also currently working on improving our tools so they're much better able to think about some of these emerging issues, for example, like what kind of levels of storage are you going to need if you're going to have very high penetration of variable renewables. Okay, so that's basically what we've been doing. Just to give you a quick hint, here's some of the screenshots of the software we put out there. It's called LEAP. And if you're interested in knowing more about what we're doing, please visit the website here. We already have over 30,000 members on this website. So it really is a community of practice of people thinking about energy policy in the developing world. So please come and visit. And I'll leave it to that. Thank you.